So when I first started getting interested in God, I began attending a Protestant church. And I still remember sitting there one Sunday when the pastor said, "Catholics worship the Pope." He went on to say, "You should never bow down to any man or kiss their hand. He's just a man, he's not God." And honestly, that comment hit me at that time. Because at the time, I didn't know much about Catholicism. So I just assumed what he was saying must be right. When you see people bowing or kissing the Pope's hand, it does look like some form of worship. But later, when I actually started to study what the church teaches, I realized how misunderstood that moment really is. It's not worship, it's actually honor. And it's actually deeply biblical. So in this video, I'm going to break down exactly what's happening when people show respect to the Pope, what those gestures actually mean, and where they come from in the Bible and why they're not exalting a man, but they're actually pointing us back to Christ himself. So why do many people, especially Protestants, believe that Catholics actually worship the Pope? In Exodus, where God says, "You shall not bow down to idols." So naturally they connect the two. Well, Catholics bow down, therefore that means that Catholics are worshiping. But here's what most people do not realize. Those same gestures, the bowing, kneeling, kissing a hand, they were all used in the Bible in contexts that had nothing to do with worship. So for example, in 1 Kings 1:23, the prophet Nathan bows before King David. And this is not because David is a god, but because he's the anointed leader of God's people. And in 2 Kings 2:15, the sons of the prophet bow before Elisha. This is to show respect for his spiritual authority. So the act of bowing doesn't automatically mean worship. It depends on the intention behind it. And that's the key difference that people miss here. Worship is about adoring God for his divinity. Respect is about recognizing God's authority working through someone else. The gestures might look the same, but the heart behind them is completely different. And that is why before we start to talk about the Pope or any outward sign of reverence, we first need to understand what worship really means. When people see Catholics bow or kneel, they automatically think they must be worshiping. But the Bible and the church makes a very clear distinction between different kinds of honor. The word for worship is latria. Latria means adoration. It's the kind of honor and love that belongs to God alone. It's what we give when we realize that his divine nature, his power, his glory, his majesty, it's towards God alone. It's not for a human being. No human being, not even the Pope, not Mary, not saints, they will never receive latria because latria is reserved for God alone. But there's another kind of honor mentioned in the church's language, and that's dulia. Dulia means reverence or respect. It's the kind of honor we give to holy people. It is to those who reflect God's presence in their lives. So when Catholics venerate the saints or show respect to the Pope, what we're doing is giving dulia. We're not giving worship, latria. There's also a special form called hyperdulia, which is given to Mary alone because she is the greatest of all creatures, the one who carried God himself. But even she is never worshipped. So think about it like this. When you stand up in a courtroom as the judge walks in, you're not worshiping the judge. You're honoring the position of authority that that person represents. And that's the exact same with the Pope. The respect shown to him isn't about who he is as a man. It's about the office that he holds as a successor of Peter. He represents a spiritual authority that traces directly back to Jesus Christ himself. When Jesus said, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." That's in Matthew 16:18. So when Catholics bow or kiss the Pope's hand, it is not an act of adoration. It's an act of recognition. Recognition of the mission that Christ has given to Peter and his successors, which was to shepherd his church. Worship exalts the creator. Honor acknowledges the representative. So they might look similar from the outside. They couldn't be more different in meaning. So let's talk about these gestures, the bowing, the kneeling, the kissing of the ring, because this is where people usually get uncomfortable. They see someone kneeling or kissing the Pope's hand and instantly think that is worship. But gestures always have meaning, and that meaning depends on your intention. In Catholic tradition, bowing and kissing the Pope's ring isn't about exalting him as a man. It's about honoring the office that he holds. The same way that you might salute a flag, right? Or stand for a judge. You're not worshiping the fabric of the flag. You're actually showing respect for that nation that it represents. The Pope's ring is actually called the fisherman's ring, symbolizing his role as successor of St. Peter. Remember, Peter was a fisherman when Jesus called him, and Jesus told him, from now on, you will be a fisher of men. That's in Luke 5:10. That moment changed everything. So every pope since then has worn the fisherman's ring as a reminder of Peter's mission to bring souls to Christ. So when people kiss that ring, they're not saying you are divine. They're simply saying, I honor the mission that Christ has given you, the mission to shepherd his church. And that's a huge difference. In fact, we see similar gestures all throughout the Bible itself. And it's not just towards God. People bow before prophets, kings, priests as a sign of respect for the authority that God has given them. So let's look at some examples right now, like in Genesis 33, when Jacob bows before Esau, or in even 1 Samuel 24, when David bows before King Saul, the very man who was trying to kill him. And why would he do that? Because Saul was still the Lord's anointed. So that act of bowing didn't mean I worship you. It means I recognize the authority that God has placed in you. And that's exactly how Catholics view gestures towards the Pope. It's not about lifting him above everyone else. It's about acknowledging the sacred responsibility that God has entrusted to him. The gesture is outward, but the meaning is inward. This is a reminder that all authority in the church comes from Christ. So let's talk about who the Pope actually is, because once you understand his real role, the idea of worshiping him just doesn't make sense anymore. The word Pope comes from the Latin word papa, which means father. He's the spiritual father of the church, not because he's divine, but because he represents the fatherly care of Christ for his people. What is his main job? It is to guard the truth of the gospel, to unify believers, and to shepherd the flock. The Pope is the successor of St. Peter, the apostle with whom Jesus said, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." That moment wasn't about giving Peter power for himself. It was about giving him responsibility. Jesus didn't say, "You will be worshipped." He said, "Feed my sheep." He gave him responsibility. And that's the essence of the papacy service. In fact, one of the Pope's most beautiful titles is Servant of the Servants of God. So think about that for a second. The most visible leader of the Catholic Church, he calls himself a servant. That's the opposite of what people imagine. When someone kneels before the Pope, it's not because they believe he's above them. It's because they recognize the sacred office that he holds and the burden that comes with that. The Pope carries the weight of over millions of souls on his shoulders. He represents unity, the same unity that Jesus prayed for in John 17 when he said that they may all be one. And that is why Catholics respect the Pope, not because of his personality, but because of his divine mission in which he continues. And that mission always points us back to Christ. Every Pope from Peter to Leo is just a man, a sinner in need of mercy. But God chooses to work through human instruments to guide his church. So when people show reverence to the Pope, they're not exalting him. They're honoring the office of Peter. This is the same office that Christ himself established 2,000 years ago. The Pope isn't a king sitting on a throne. He's a shepherd watching over the flock. And that is why the church calls him the servant of the servants of God. So next, I want to clear something up. You've probably heard some of these before yourself. And if you haven't, you definitely will at some point. First being that the Pope claims to be God on earth. This is absolutely not true. That's a myth that's been circulating for a while now, but the truth is the Pope is just a man, a sinner, who goes to confession just like everybody else. The church has never taught that the Pope is divine. His authority is ministerial, not divine. He represents Christ. He does not replace him. In fact, the Pope serves Christ. He never competes with him. The next misunderstanding is calling the Pope Holy Father is blasphemy. I understand why that phrase can sound uncomfortable for some people, because Jesus says in Matthew 23:9, "Call no man on earth Father." But here's what Jesus meant. He was warning against pride and self-exaltation, not banning the word Father. Paul himself in 1 Corinthians 4:15 says, "I became your father in Christ Jesus through the gospel." The term Holy Father simply means spiritual father, one who's been set apart for God's service. It's a title of mission, not divinity. The third misunderstanding is that Catholics obey the Pope instead of God. The Pope's entire job is to lead people to God, not away from him. When the Pope teaches officially on faith and morals, simply reaffirming what God has already revealed, not inventing new truths. His authority comes from Christ, and it's limited by Christ. So obedience to the Pope, when rightly understood, is obedience to truth. God entrusted that truth to the church. So, as you can see, the idea that Catholics worship the Pope, it just does not hold up. Every gesture, every title, every tradition, when you trace it back, it points not to the glory of a man, but to the glory of God working through his church. And that's really what this whole conversation comes down to. It's not about a man, it's about Christ working through a man. God has always done that. He has used human instruments to guide his people. Think about it, all the way from Moses to Peter to now the current pope, because Peter was the first pope. And even though the world sees bowing and assumes that that is worship, the heart behind those actions is something completely different. It is reverence, it's love for God's church, and it's faith in the promise that Jesus made. I am with you always, even until the end of the age. That's in Matthew 28:20. And that is why Catholics show honor to the Pope, because he's the visible reminder of Christ's church, that it's still standing, it's still teaching, and it's still being guided by the same Holy Spirit that came down on Pentecost. All right, so I hope that clears all this misunderstanding about worshiping the Pope and some false beliefs and misunderstandings about the Pope in general, and help you kind of understand his position more and his mission and all of that. So I hope this video helped in any kind of way. Glory be to God if it did. I hope you guys all have an amazing day today. God bless, and see you guys in the next one.